Welcome to the July 20th meeting of the Murfreesboro City Council. Councilmember Rick LaLance has our prayer. And we also have a special guest tonight. We have Connor Ott, who's here from Boy Scout Troop 398, and his father, Carl Ott, who's here, and the brother Cole's going to be here, or is here. So when the prayer's over with, Connor is going to come up and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And Connor is fulfilling one of the requirements for his Communications Merit Badge. So we're glad you're here.
All right, guys, if you'll bow with me. Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for all the blessings in our lives. Thank you for this city and the future that it holds. Lord, just please be with us tonight. We need you, as always, and I hope that you'll give us wisdom. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Connor. The only ceremonial item we have tonight, we've got our second installment. We have our Rutherford County historian here, Greg Tucker. So Greg's been coming once a month to give us sort of a history lesson, a 10-minute history lesson of Murfreesboro. So Greg, podium's yours. We're glad you're back.
Well, I'm flattered to be a ceremonial item. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I thought it'd be appropriate tonight to talk to you a little bit about infrastructure. Infrastructure issues, sometimes arise from rapid growth. And for the last couple of years, we've certainly been seeing rapid growth. But that's not the first time this city's had those kind of issues. I want to look back about 150 years ago in the period following the harsh times of Reconstruction, when Murfreesboro really began to grow rapidly and industrialize and enjoyed an influx of capital. And one of the things that's particularly interesting about that period is one man seems to have figured in almost all of the infrastructure projects of that period. His name was Mason. He was a prosperous attorney. Well, he served for 10 years as the city attorney. You wonder how he got to be prosperous. Maybe he wrote his own contract. During that time period, he built an office building, which came to be known as the Mason Court Building. It was on the corner of East Main and Spring Street. The Bank of America sits on that corner now. I'm part of that. He packed a bunch of his attorney friends in there and some other brokers and such. He also had an opera house on the square. Now, opera back then meant something a little different. They weren't talking about grand opera, and they weren't talking about Grand Ole Opry. They were talking about virtually anything that involved a live performance, from minstrel to Shakespeare. A lot of traveling companies came through. And you think, well, now, how popular would that have been in 1880s, 1890s Murfreesboro? Mason's operation was one of 6 opera houses on and around the square at that time. He decided in 1892 that Murfreesboro needed a rapid transit or a mass transit system. So I'm sure using his connections with the city, he got the rights to lay a rail system from down on West Main Street near the railroad terminal, where he had his garage and a stable. He stopped short of trying to electrify. He had mules to pull the rail cars. And the tracks came up West Main to the square. If you were going east, you went the south side of the square. If you were going west, you went the north side of the square. Out Main Street to University Street. There it turned left, went 2 blocks, turned left again, and then weaved itself through what was then the prosperous, more affluent parts of Murfreesboro, until it got down to what we now call Maple Street. At that time, it was the Lebanon Turnpike. And about the corner of Oak Street and Maple Street, they built a turntable. They had unharnessed the mules, and using leg power, they would rotate the rail car and hook it back up and come back down. It operated for 2 years, and the literature we found essentially says that there was never a day that it made enough money to cover the expenses of operation. So after 2 years, it was abandoned. But undaunted, Mason decided that Murfreesboro needed a rail link to Woodbury. So he got a couple of partners, and they went out and bought rights and leased rights right away and such. And then they attempted to sell shares, and nobody was interested. It seems like there were some Teamsters who had already met the demand out there. One guy with a similar name named Dave Macon was running a wagon service, and people just weren't interested in adding a railroad. Another project that Mason initiated, which was a winner for him, was the first water works in Murfreesboro. Now, up to this time, Murfreesboro depended all on springs and wells for its water. There was no processing, as we say today, treatment of water. But Mason and a couple of his partners were using private capital, private venture, set up the first waterworks, and not surprisingly, they put it at the headwaters of Town Creek down here, and it eventually evolved into what some of us remember, and the city took it over. And his enterprise was laying, again, he had good connections with the city. He was laying pipes up and down the streets and connecting people on. Being a good businessman, he knew that all this fresh water he was delivering, treated water that he was delivering, people must be taking a whole lot more baths. And so he opened Murfreesboro and built Murfreesboro's first soap factory. He did his first batch. And remember, soap up until that time was all homemade. But he did his commercial operation, made 10,000 bars of soap. And about that time, the Enterprise Soap Company in Nashville saw the threat of competition. They flooded the market with their product, pricing it at about half of what it cost Mason to make his bar, and put him out of business. But never say die. Still in control of the waterworks, he was aware that this Tennessee College, which came to be known as Tennessee College for Women, was being planned and was going to be on University Street in East Main. And there were going to be 150 to 200 young women living all together in a dormitory on the top floor of the college building. And they connected to his water system. Well, he knew if the water went in, there's going to be a lot of water coming out. So he also built the first sewer line in Murfreesboro. It served the Tennessee College for Women. It's about 1908. And then went straight down East College all the way down to Lytle Creek, where it dumped in Lytle Creek. That didn't bother anybody at the time because, remember, I said sewer line, not sewer treatment. And up until that time, the creek had always been the main sewer line for the city. One curious thing about Mr. Mason is that we don't know his full name. Every reference I've found to him, they simply use his initials. And every time he had to sign a document, he simply used his initials. But to help you remember, just remember that the first sewer line built in Murfreesboro was built by P.P. Mason. I hope I'll be back next month.
So for those of y'all that didn't watch last month, the 2 months that Greg has taught, we've talked about fake news and PP. So Greg, we're looking forward to next month. That's right. All right, thank you, Greg. We really appreciate that. And we'll have to get Darren Gore, our water and sewer director, to maybe do some research on that. I'm sure he'll have a PowerPoint presentation. He'll want to bring up on that. All right, you have the consent agenda in front of you. You have 5 different items.
There's no questions or comments on the consent agenda. I move for approval.
Second.
Motion is second. Ms. Wright, will call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shepard.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. You have the meeting of the July 13, 2017 special meeting and the July 13, 2017 special meeting for public comments. Any additions or deletions to the minutes?
Move for approval.
Second.
Motion is second. Ms. Wright?
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second and final reading ordinance 17 OZ 30 to amend approximately 70.7 acres of planned signage overlay PSO district located at 1700 1840 Medical Center Parkway.
Move for approval.
Second. Motion is second. Ms. Wright?
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second and final reading ordinance 17 OZ 22 to rezone an area located along New Salem Highway to Planned Residential Development PRD District, Bell Tower Apartments PRD.
Move for approval.
Second.
Motion is second. Ms. Wright?
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second and final reading ordinance 16 OZ 60 to rezone an area along Wilkinson Pike and Gresham Park Drive to mixed use MU District. Tommy Smith applicant.
So moved.
Second. Motion is second. Ms. Wright?
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
No.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. New business pursuant to Resolution 17 RPH 31 adopted by the City Council on June 15, 2017. We will conduct a public hearing and consider a proposed amendment to rezone approximately 13.9 acres along Tennessee Boulevard from Commercial Fringe CF District to Planned Residential Development PRD District, Brookwood Point PRD. Old South Properties applicant 2017-416. Notice of the said public hearing was published in the July 3, 2017 issue of a local newspaper.
Good evening, Mayor McFarland and council members. I'm Donald Anthony with the Planning Department. Old South Properties has submitted an application for a rezoning of a nearly 14-acre property located along the northeast side of North Tennessee Boulevard. The property is currently zoned CF, or Commercial Fringe. The applicant is requesting rezoning to PRD, or Planned Residential District, to allow an 82-unit townhouse development. The gross density of this development would be 5.9 dwelling units per acre. The development would consist of 22 buildings, each having anywhere from 3 to 5 townhouse units in each building. Each townhouse would have a 2-car garage as well as driveway parking. Surrounding zoning includes RZ on the north and northeast, RM16 on the east, PRD on the west, and CF on the south. As shown on the conceptual site layout on page 13 of the pattern book, a Type C or 12-foot landscape buffer would be installed along the northern side of the property, which abuts an existing single-family residential subdivision. The city's comprehensive plan, Murfreesboro 2035, shows this property as appropriate for neighborhood commercial. This is a character classification that corresponds to the existing CF zoning that's already on the site. The City Council obviously has the leeway to consider requests that vary from the recommended character classification. And if the council ultimately decides to approve the rezoning request, then the land use map would be updated accordingly. The Planning Commission reviewed this request at its June 7th meeting and voted to forward this request to you with a favorable recommendation. All of that being said, the applicant has indicated that an environmental analysis is currently being conducted on this site, and the applicant would like to have this item deferred until such time that that analysis is completed. Because the public hearing was advertised for tonight, we would ask that you go ahead and conduct the public hearing with the understanding that the applicant wishes to defer action on the request until a later time. Staff can answer any questions that you may have before or after the public hearing. And Matt Taylor from SEC is here to talk more about this request. Thank you.
Mr. Taylor.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. I'm Matt Taylor of SEC here in town, and I do have a brief PowerPoint presentation for you. Over what we have termed Brookwood Point. Start by orienting you to the site. Mr. Anthony did a good job of that, but it is about 14 acres on the north side of North Tennessee Boulevard, just past the intersection of North Tennessee and West Northfield. The site, eastern half of the site is wooded, while the western half has some scrub, but is mainly dominated by a stockpile of soil and construction debris from previous activities in the area. Utilities are stubbed out of North Tennessee on the south side of the project, as well as sewer stubbed out on the northeast corner of the project. Currently, there are townhomes to the west of us, apartments to the further west of us, single-family homes on the north side. Then we've got a mixture of townhomes and apartments on the east side. And then on the south side is further commercial fringe zoning district, just like this property. Here's a picture. This is looking east along North Tennessee. This would put our property to the left of the picture. Here's the stockpile of material on the western portion of the property, and this is looking east across the growth on that half of the property. Plan itself, we have requested a PRD to replace the current commercial fringe zoning district. This would allow us to construct 82 proposed townhomes on just under 14 acres in size. That'll give us a density of 5.9 units to the acre. These units will all be for sale. They are age restricted to 55 plus, and we'll have all underground utilities throughout the development. We've planned for a landscape buffer along the entire northern boundary of the project and normal planting yards on the east and west where we abut other townhome or apartment districts. Along North Tennessee, we've planned decorative fencing as well as landscaping there to try to match up somewhat with our neighbors to the west to create a cohesive feel. All of our owners here, it'll be required that they are members of a mandatory HOA. That HOA will be managed by a third-party association. These units will be sold through a horizontal property regime. So the owners will own what's underneath the building and inside the four walls, with some limited access or limited rights to some features outside, such as their driveway and some limited areas behind their units. The community is very walkable. We've got sidewalks planned on both sides of all the streets, as well as walking trails flanked by benches through the open area. Trash receptacles will be through individual carts, through a private service, and those will be contained within the residents' garages when not in use. And these will all be private streets, which will be maintained by the HOA. The units themselves will be a mixture of 1- and 2-story homes. Again, they are age restricted to 55 plus. Each one will have a 2-car garage and have an option of a screen porch or sunroom for the outdoor living features. Square footages will range from 1,500 to about 2,250 square feet in size. We do propose all high-quality building materials: brick, stone, cement board siding. No vinyl except for in the trim and soffit areas. These are the same units that are currently being built at Rockbridge Cove, which is off Lascassas Highway, directly across the street from the fairly recently built Kroger. You can see from the pictures, they intermix the materials, work the front elevations in and out, vary the roof lines, so it's very interesting architecture and a good-looking structure. And a view from the rear. The amenities, we feel like those start at the entryway with the signage into the development. And then that will be immediately followed by green space on the right-hand side or eastern side of the entry drive, where we'll have the walking trail and benches and landscaping. And then along our frontage, we plan for decorative fencing and landscaping to match our neighbors to the west. Access, again, they'll all be private streets. We've only planned one access point, and that's on the western side of the project, coming off North Tennessee Boulevard. We didn't have an opportunity to connect any other properties because they're all planned and fully developed or under construction currently. We did hold a neighborhood meeting on May 8th. We had about 15 neighbors in attendance at that meeting. The main point of concern that I heard at that meeting was drainage. So during that meeting, we had committed to creating a preliminary grading plan, and we did that, presented that to engineering staff, prior to our Planning Commission public hearing to make sure they were on board with our general plan. They were. So we moved forward with that plan. We would develop a more detailed design with full calculations at the site plan level if we were to get there. So, and as Mr. Anthony indicated, we are waiting for a wetland confirmation to come back from the state. We've done a delineation, have about what our consultant says is about half an acre on site, so we want to get that confirmed by TDEC before you make any motions or take action is our request. We expect that to be back within the next 2 weeks, but that is outside of our control. So I'll be happy to answer any questions now or after the public hearing.
Any questions for Mr. Taylor?
And Matt, Mr. Taylor, are you saying that, so somebody dropped us a letter here that says that the TDEC says there are wetlands on the property? Are you saying that's the half acre?
They have met, our consultant at TDEC met on site, which is a routine action, and they have, our consultant has further delineated what he approximated to be about a half an acre, and so he's compiling his report for TDEC to confirm his delineation.
Gotcha.
All right, before we hold the public hearing, anyone wishing to speak for or against, we ask that if you're representing a group, you can speak for 5 minutes. If you're representing an individual, 3 minutes. If you'll keep all of your questions directed toward the council at the end of the public hearing, we'll get those answered. If you don't mind, when you do come to the podium, if you'll please state your name and your address. Anyone wishing to speak for or against, please come to the podium.
My name is Fred Marino. I live in the properties behind this proposed development. I want to thank Mayor McFarland and Councilman LaLance for responding to my email on June 15th, 16th. That was kind of you. In the interim, since that time, I have walked this property with the representative from TDEC, Mike Lee. At that time, he knew that a Mr. Groh, who was apparently working for SEC, had come to the property and did not think it was a very valuable wetland. In fact, the property at this point is still considered an exceptional Tennessee Highland wetland, which is the highest rating you can have for a wetland. And I'm sorry I didn't have enough copies for everybody. I apologize. But I'll read this. The division conducted a site visit on the proposed Northwood subdivision on East Northfield Boulevard in Murfreesboro. The visit revealed the presence of jurisdictional wetlands on the property. Any proposed development will need to conduct and submit a wetland delineation to the division and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Any alterations to the wetlands will also require permits from both agencies. During that visit with him, we spent about an hour, and he was showing me all the things that qualify it as a wetland. Rust in the soil, never knew that. A certain soil that has decomposed organic matter, not our typical backyard, as he put it. It has plants that are not only unique to wetlands, but we have one plant in that delineated by Dr. Estes from Austin Peay, a pretty well-known botanist, and we have 2 plants on that property. One that's endangered and the only known area in all of Tennessee to have that plant. This is an exceptional wetland, is quite rare. It qualifies as high as the one that's being dealt with at Oaklands. Mr. Huddleston was kind enough to respond to this, and the comparison of the Oaklands wetland to this, he thought didn't qualify. Well, there's no higher wetland classification than exceptional, and currently this is listed as exceptional. The process to take an exceptional wetland and build on it has to go through the permitting process. A study will be made, recommendations will be made, and hearings will be performed at the state level. If a decision is found to be favorable to the construction company, then they will have to mitigate it. Mr. Lee knows of one other time in Tennessee where an exceptional wetland was ever mitigated. It was in Clarksville. It has to show tremendous economic or social impact to the community. I don't think 82 townhomes qualify. If, in fact, it gets to that process and there is mitigation offered, the last time an exceptional wetland was mitigated was that time in Clarksville. It went at a mitigation rate of 1 acre per 400 acres. I don't know that that makes this property viable. It depends, I guess, on how much Old South wants to put into it. I also contacted Caitlin Elam, who works for TDEC, and she informed me. I had a similar experience a few years ago where all the trees were cut down before anybody did anything official, and the trees were gone when they found out they couldn't cut down the trees.
Mr. Marino, if you don't mind, we're almost a little over 4 minutes. If you want to sum it up,
what she told me was if any work is done on this property that disrupts the soil, to call her immediately, and the enforcement agencies from the Army Corps will be there immediately to stop it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marino. Thank you for the emails as well. Anyone else wishing to speak for or against?
Good afternoon. I'm Pat Gibson, and I'm also a neighbor. I'm next door to Fred Marino, and I have also talked to members of TDEC, and just out of concern as to this wetland being converted without proper procedure, and if they can go through the proper procedure and get approval by TDEC, that's one thing. But I would ask that this council refrain from making any decision on this until TDEC can give authorization to convert this wetland.
Okay. Mr. Gibson, tell us your address, please.
My address is 2008 Terra Green.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak for or against?
Good evening, Mayor and council members. My name is Steve Nix. I'm at 1805 Mosaic Trail. My property is at the northeast corner of this proposed project. I purchased this project roughly 12 years ago. I was told that it was a wetlands. It was a designated wetlands. My plat for my property says it's a wetlands. In fact, most of the wetlands runs through my backyard. I was told at that point in time if I was to conduct any type of further construction projects on my property, I would have to be permitted through TDEC, i.e. if I wanted to build a swimming pool, I would have to come propose the project. I would have to be permitted. Like my other neighbors, I ask that proper diligence is done on this project by the council, Rutherford County, and the city of Murfreesboro. My neighbors, we have done our diligence as best we possibly can, and I certainly ask that this council, mayor, city of Murfreesboro, and Rutherford County do their diligence before we move forward with this project. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. We'll close the public hearing. And Mr. Huddleston, do you mind coming and giving us just the process that now what will this will have to go through?
Good evening, Mayor McFarland, members of City Council, Sam Huddleston, City Engineering Department. Mayor, this is something that we encounter from time to time on projects where wetlands are identified, and really Mr. Taylor had mentioned that they'll have to evaluate the impact of the wetlands on their plan. They'll get a confirmation from TDEC, and then they'll need to make a decision on how to deal with it, protect it in place, mitigate it in place. And so there's a variety of options for them. But any plan that would modify that obviously would need a permit from TDEC and apparently the Corps of Engineers based on their statement to exercise jurisdiction. And we observe those things, and when we're aware of them, we hold up permits and approvals before any land disturbing activities are authorized by the city at those locations.
And for the homeowners, how long of a process do we expect this before it'll be either not coming back to us, or how long? Mr. Taylor, do you have an idea of what to expect?
We are comfortable coming back once that we have a confirmation from TDEC that they basically agree with our delineation and the quality of the wetland. And once we know that, then we know what the impact is on our project. Our consultant says it is of his professional opinion that it's a low quality wetland, and if that's the case at half an acre, it is economically feasible to mitigate, and that would be our plan. If TDEC does not agree with that interpretation and comes back with something else with a different acreage or a higher classification, then we would have to reevaluate at that point. And that's why we want to get that confirmation before y'all take action.
Okay. All right, so item B, which is the rezoning request, is being deferred. Do we have a good way that when we get information back through the planning department that we have the addresses, but we can make sure and contact the homeowners to let them know when that, if there's a next step, when that next step will be?
Sure, we'll see if we can't get the homeowners association information and forward it to them that way.
Okay. All right.
Let me just ask one question. If there's any change in this plan because of the mitigation or because of the wetlands designation, then it has to go back through the process again, or you'll have to create a new plan, and or where do we stand?
There's some flexibility in that for the planning director. If we're losing units, it allows him to say it meets the same intent as what we had before, as long as we're not increasing density, getting closer to property lines, those sorts of things. But that's why we wanted to hold up at this stage, and then if we do have to modify the plan, we'll bring the modified plan back to you when we come back.
Hey, Matt, I know in my younger years I used to go and hunt rabbit on this property, and it was, in the wintertime, it was pretty sloppy out there at times, so I understand the water problem. And we'd also pull cedar trees off of it at Christmas time. It never got permission, but we never got shot for getting one either. But there is potential that with a detention pond that it could actually improve not just the property that you're discussing, but also surrounding property with drainage concerns, couldn't it?
Absolutely. One of the things that we see when we do start developing is a structured drainage system can not only make our site drain properly and like it's supposed to, but it helps the areas around that maybe have slow drainage. Is a good term to use there. The water's probably getting off the property. It's just very, very slow, and we can provide those outlets. Sometimes that involves the neighboring property to do some improvements on their own property to get it to our infrastructure, but we can provide those opportunities a lot of times.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you.
Mr. Tindall, do you know what the statute of limitations for trespassing and theft are?
Merry Christmas.
Sure. All right, we'll move to item 7. Pursuant to Resolution 17R PH32, adopted by the City Council on June 15, 2017, we'll conduct a public hearing to consider a proposed amendment to rezone approximately 7.2 acres along White Poplar Court from single-family residential 15 RS15 district to planned residential development PRD district, Poplar Grove PRD. Richard Reeves is the applicant. 2017-402. Notice this said public hearing was published in the July 3rd, 2017 issue of a local newspaper.
Thank you, Mayor McFarland. The applicant, Richard Reeves, has submitted an application for rezoning of a 7.2-acre property located along White Poplar Court. This is east of Pitts Lane. The property is currently zoned RS15 and is platted for a 17-unit single-family residential development. The applicant is requesting rezoning to PRD, or Planned Residential District, to allow a 32-unit single-family residential development. The gross density of this development would be 3.46 dwelling units per acre. The development would be recorded as a horizontal property regime on a single lot of record. Currently, White Poplar Court is a public street, and if this rezoning is approved, the applicant will have to petition to have the city abandon the right-of-way, and if that request is approved, maintenance of White Poplar Court would then become the responsibility of the homeowners association. As shown on page 4A of the pattern book, the applicant has agreed to install a landscape screen around the perimeter of the property. The landscape screen would consist of a 10-foot planting yard, and the applicant has agreed to try to preserve as many existing trees as possible. During the Planning Commission review of this request, the Commission made a recommendation that the landscape screen be installed at one time rather than on a lot-by-lot basis or a house-by-house basis to ensure that the landscaping will mature uniformly. Adjacent zoning includes RD on the east and RS15 on the north, west, and south. Murfreesboro 2035 shows this area as appropriate for suburban residential, which is a range of 2 to 3.54 dwelling units per acre, and the density in this request is consistent with that character classification. The Planning Commission reviewed this request at its June 7th meeting and voted to send this forward to you with a favorable recommendation. Staff can answer any questions that you may have before or after the public hearing, and John Gordon from Weiser Consultants is here to talk more about this request.
Mr. Anthony, can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
I was actually doing some math, just trying to figure out the plat on the 17, because I'd spoken to a neighbor and they said it was 7+ acres, and if I do the math, that would come out to be where you could actually, the density under RS15 would suit 21 homes. Just the plat that somebody drew up was 17. Is that right?
That's right.
How do we get to 3.46 dwelling units per acre? Am I messing up on my math? If we're looking at how many units? 32 and 7.2, isn't that 4.4 units per acre?
If it's a math mistake, it is most likely that it's mine. But give me just a minute, and we'll
since you brought up the range, I just want to make sure we're square on this. I didn't even know about the range, but we're talking.
Yes, I'm getting that same thing, and I apologize for the error. So that is slightly higher than what the that's about 1 unit higher than what the character.
I just want to make sure I was.
My apologies.
Messing up, but it was important though to know that it could have been 21 as is.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Mr. Gordon.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. My name is John Gordon. I'm representing the applicant for this rezoning to PRD. This was formerly Tulip Poplar subdivision, 17 lots. It's going to become planned residential development with 32 home sites with 3 common areas. As staff mentioned, it's also going to be using horizontal property regime for property ownership, which means the light green areas on your sketch are also technically common space. People will own the orange rectangular areas on there. Those are the maximum building areas. So as each homeowner selects a specific plan, then that home will be set within that orange space on the drawing. This area is along Pitts Lane, and the existing infrastructure is in place from the development of Tulip Poplar subdivision. The roadway is a permeable paver roadway, which was a pilot project for the city using permeable pavers for the stormwater treatment. We also have existing water and sewer. Our gas lines are out there, so all the existing utilities are in place. There are some modifications that are going to be needed for the increased number of homes, and that also is part of why we have 32 proposed homes, and I'll get to that with the next slide. These are the tulip poplar trees that are involved with naming the subdivision. On this drawing, basically each two of the new homes is split from one lot of the previous subdivision, and that allows us to use the existing water and sewer services and existing electric with minor modifications. That's why we have 32 homes out of the original 17 lots. We also have common space areas which will be developed with amenities for the community. Looking at the elevations for the homes that will be allowed, this project is in concept similar to the retreat at Marymount, which is an existing project that's been successful out by Rucker Lane. So the homeowners will be able to select from a set number of plans that will then go on each of the home sites. So we have some examples of those elevations for each, and the details of this are laid out in the pattern book. And then I have some photos of some of the existing properties at the retreat at Marymount. So these are similar to what will be built at Poplar Grove. So there are some houses, and then some. We are planning a pavilion at the back of the cul-de-sac. So these building elevations and photos are representative of the actual houses that will be constructed. And finally, I wanted to touch on the perimeter landscaping. We received several comments about perimeter landscaping at the neighborhood meeting. We've received individual comments, and I know that some neighbors have emailed planning commissioners and members of the council to add their comments. And so at the planning commission, the commissioners wanted us to provide a detail of just what that perimeter landscaping would be. And so we've added sheet 4A that defines that. As staff went over that, exactly what the perimeter landscaping will be with our planting density of 10 feet on center with the broad growing evergreens. And I can answer any questions if you have any.
Any questions for Mr. Gordon? Thank you, Mr. Gordon. All right, we'll now open the public hearing. Anyone wishing to speak for or against this rezoning request, please come to the podium.
Hello, Mayor, Council. I'm Tom Tyner at 2260 Pitch Lane, Murfreesboro. And I would like to urge the council to think about deferring the vote on this tonight. I think the absence of opposition at the meetings is probably misleading. Might lead you to suggest that community residents are not concerned or opposed to the rezoning. Fact is, the vast majority of people I've spoken with in the last few days were unaware of the rezoning request. I know there's a sign posted about ground level stating, given the number to call. I didn't notice it myself until about Wednesday of last week. That's when I notified the rest of the neighborhood, and I got a lot of feedback from people. Overwhelmingly negative, overwhelmingly opposed to this proposal. One reason you might want to think about reconsidering it, besides the discontent of the neighborhood about it, is there's no long-term plan to handle the additional traffic that the proposed type of construction will generate over time. I talked with Mr. Ram Balahandran yesterday, and there's no long-term plan in place. Another thing is there's an individual concerned with water runoff, and I think Ian's here to talk about that. If the council decides to vote on this tonight, I would urge the council to deny the rezoning proposal. One reason is their big concern of people is traffic. From what I've heard people and people that have been emailing me, there are currently 102 houses on Pitts Lane and in adjacent subdivisions whose sole access to the main thoroughfares is Pitts Lane. It's the only way out of those subdivisions. Pitts Lane isn't very long. It's got 3 schools at the end of it, so during the school year, a lot of congestion there. And there's really no plan in place to alleviate that.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer.
Yes.
Your 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Do you want to talk some?
Okay. Thank you very much.
How much do I have? 5 minutes, 3 minutes?
It's
going now? Okay. My name is Ian Matheson, and I live at 1417 Avellino Circle in the Mirabella subdivision off of Pitts Lane and across from the proposed development. My home backs onto Pitts Lane with a lot running approximately 200 feet along Pitts Lane. My concern is with the proposed zoning change relating to the surface water runoff. By increasing the number of residences in White Poplar from 17, which was the original proposal, to 32, the surface water entering the Pitts Lane drainage system will obviously be substantially increased, since less ground is obviously available for drainage as a result of the increase in the number of homes. Now, the water from Pitts Lane empties into my backyard in an attempt to reach a culvert which is on the easement of the property between myself, the lady here, my next door neighbor. And I brought this issue to the attention of the city many years ago without any meaningful suggestions or resulting actions. Indeed, currently, a heavy rain results in a significant portion of my backyard being transformed into a sizable pond which reaches from Pitts Lane approximately 150 feet towards my home. Additional surface water, which would result from the proposed modification of the zoning for White Poplar, will undoubtedly result in probably a lake instead of a pond, which will further encroach on my home. Thus, I believe that in the absence of any plan for the removal of surface water, a zoning change should not be supported until an appropriate plan is submitted by the developers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews.
Hello, Mr. Mayor, Council. My name is Avent Lane. I live at 221 North Highland Avenue, which is a little distance away from where Pitts Lane is and where these folks live. A couple of things. I know y'all have a comprehensive plan that y'all have worked hard on and everything, and that's a good thing. But I see all too often in this city and in this county, you make these zoning that's zoned RS-15, and every time we turn around, every 5 or 10 years, the zoning changes. Why did we zone it to begin with if we're not going to follow what we agreed to in the past? We got to have places to live. I will readily say that, and I want to know who this benefits. If you put in the zoning change on White Poplar Court, other developers will follow suit, and I don't blame them. It's about making money. Don't have a problem with that. But also, that's a potential for 300 new homes, and this would have a very negative effect on the community. And what is our biggest problem in this community? Traffic, traffic, traffic. Over on Highland Avenue, I'm living with a lot of traffic, and I'm afraid it's going to get worse. But I would say to you what Mr. Tyner suggested, if you don't deny this tonight, at least defer it so more people can have more input. Because we need to get some things understood between the city of Murfreesboro and the people of Murfreesboro about, are we going to just develop everything we can? We're going to change what we planned out years ago, or are we going to keep changing it for the benefit of a few people, other than the people that move in get the obvious benefit, but also people making the money off of it. That's an obvious benefit. Don't begrudge them making money, because most of my kinfolk are realtors and developers anyway. But that's, I hope you would defer this until we have more input from the people in the community. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Sally Benedict, and I live across the street from this proposed property on Bear Branch Cove. And I've walked this plot of land. It's very attractive. I'm not opposed to these very nice developments on this land, but to jump from 17 to 32 seems rather drastic, rather sudden. The development has been finished the street for quite some time, and a sign for sale, for land for sale, plots for sale for quite some time, and there hasn't been a single purchase for this land. And that's my belief why they've decided to go and ask for this change, is they can't get someone to buy the land for what it is. Well, let's make it smaller, more affordable. Maybe someone can afford that, and the plots will sell. And that's fine. However, what I would ask you also to consider is that this property location between Northfield and DeJarnett was entirely single-family homes. Each one of these land developments started with one house, and that person sold that house. They were on 5 acres, 7 acres, in this case, maybe 10 acres. And each one of these single-family home developments and acreage is going to a housing development like this. My own development is one of these. It was the old Dodd Ranch. And it's been now sold into plots, and that's where I live. So I understand big homes, big plots are making room for smaller plots and more people, and that's fine. However, going again, I just have to say, going from 17 to 32 is a pretty big jump. My concern is that there are about 10 other plots along Pitts Lane that are in this exact same position. You can see there was a sale of one of these plots, a home with acreage, very recently in the last 2 weeks. It has a barn on it. It used to be a horse barn. I can envision that it's going to be a new neighborhood. You can just see it. There's my neighborhood, there's Loveless Lane, there's Marabella, and there's one more down at the end of the street towards Northfield. They all started with a single home, and now it's a big neighborhood. So each one of these is going to be a new neighborhood, and if we make this change for this neighborhood, what change are we going to make for the next neighborhood and the next neighborhood? Because it's all going to be developed. We can see that coming. So I ask you to keep it at a relatively small acreage. The concern that you, Councilman, brought up, that how can this work, it's not right to jump from 17 to 32. There's 2 schools located at the end on DeJarnett, and at times it's almost impossible to get out of your own neighborhood. And to go from this condensed neighborhood in such a short period of time, knowing that more of these neighborhoods are coming, I think that's a consideration you should make as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Benedict.
Thank you, Mayor and Councilman, for allowing us all to speak. My name is Dorothy Murphy, and I live at 2371 Pitts Lane. I've got three main concerns, and one is what happens to property value when you start in your neighborhood making little tiny lots. And I don't know what y'all think the purpose of zoning is, but one of the things I think it is to protect homeowners and taxpayers who've invested in the city. And just shutting my eyes and visualizing this road with basically 17 driveways on each side, and with more than half the frontage of every house is garages. That's the vision of that neighborhood to me. The second point is the same one the lady just made. You know, if you're going from 17 to 32, you're basically going from RS15, and I made this up, RS8. And I don't know if that's a real designation, but that's about relatively what you're doing. And I think that that's a precedent-changing move for that street, because there are lots of people with lots of land, and it could permanently change our neighborhood. And the third point is there already is a current precedent set. I've lived there for 23 years. I was there when Mirabella developed, was there when Anatole developed, was there when Bear Branch Cove developed, I was there when McKinley Place developed, and when Loveless Lane developed. And when you saw his first picture of the 17, those were still the smallest lots, you know. But the precedent is that's an RS15 neighborhood, and that's what we as neighbors would like to see it stay as. Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to speak for or against?
Hi, I'm Melissa Meyer. I'm at 2130 Patriot Drive. I was the sole person to speak at the last planning commission meeting, and this development is literally in our backyard. And so when it was originally going to be a single property, I echo what I said last time. It was a single property when they knocked on our door and said that they were going to be putting up one house on the 7+ acres, and that they were going to be putting a fence in our backyard. And then it turned to 17, and then has, you know, almost doubled again. So obviously it changes our backyard significantly. And then we did talk about, you know, that there are mature tree lines around the property, but I just wanted to confirm, again, I'm not thrilled with the fact that, you know, the number of houses have doubled, you know, in our backyard. I agree with my neighbors running on Pitts. The traffic is horrendous at times, and it's impossible to get out off Patriot Drive or get off, you know, onto Pitts. It's just a 2-lane road. But in the same token, you know, I just wanted to confirm, I didn't hear what the gentleman said from Weiser, that our 5 properties, whether it's 17 or whether it's 32, that our 5 properties that have no tree line, that is the section that is, was it broadly growing evergreens, did I hear? If that was what was going to be, that's what they were talking about, is our 5 properties where we have no buffer. Just wanted to confirm.
Thank you very much, Ms. Meyer. Anyone else wishing to speak? Okay, seeing none, we'll close. Oh, sorry.
All right.
Back open.
All right, thank you. Mayor and City Council, thank you. My name is David Alcorn. I live at 113 Lexham Court, and I'm the owner of Southern Lifestyle Homes. I'm not the developer, but we are the ones requesting to be the home builder in this neighborhood. And I wrote down a lot of the things that were mentioned tonight. I know Mr. Tyner, I talked to him on the phone the other night. And one of his main concerns, I know he had 3, and I think we got to 2 of them. One of them was traffic. And as I explained to him, and I think what his concern about is the traffic that already exists on Pitts Lane because of how it connects to other major streets. What I was sharing with him, and here's the neat thing about Poplar Grove, we do have a successful neighborhood with 54 built homes, just like what these homes would be in the retreat at Marymount. In those houses, you can drive by them. What was proposed before is 17 larger lots, but larger homes, bigger box homes. In those big box homes, traditionally you have several cars. If you go through the retreat, this is an empty nester style neighborhood. The car impact is a whole lot less. The school traffic impact is a whole lot less. In the 54 homes that we have in the retreat, we have one school-age child, and they're driven to Middle Tennessee Christian. They're to a private school. Car impact the same way. Restrictions require cars to be in the garage. The garages are not to be used as storage. There may be one out in the garage, out in the driveway, but not excessive car traffic. So as far as adding to the car, it's only by other example of the retreat. I think the issue is what is already there on Pitts, not pertaining to this neighborhood. The other thing about water runoff, and I know Mr. Mattinson, I met him at the neighborhood meeting that we had, and I think maybe Mr. Gordon can answer the question on the water runoff, what's happening. Of course, there's pavers, and the driveways will also be pavers, permeable pavers. And of course, I think a lot of this water is running off the back side of the property, but he can answer the calculations and such like that to know. I think there's already an existing drainage for his backyard that we want to make sure this has no impact on what his problem is. Values of houses. These homes are going to be priced at $500,000 plus. It is an empty nester. It is an upscale construction. What we find with these houses and with the PRD and what we're asking, obviously the straight zoning, anything can be built. The only thing that controls what's built in there is restrictions and lot prices. That can change at any time during the development. What we're asking for is a PRD that puts the teeth to the control of how it's built and how it's maintained. Also, we're asking to put the road as a private road, so the paver system is something that is maintained by the HOA. We have the infrastructure. The other, Ms. Meyer, I believe, had mentioned about the screening, and we addressed that since the last public hearing. We had mentioned in our neighborhood meeting, we'd had a couple neighborhood meetings as well, but we had an official neighborhood meeting on April 17th, and what was mentioned was putting a landscape screen between the neighborhoods. Now, this is residential to residential. No landscape screen is necessarily required, but we offered that we would do it. At the city or at the Planning Commission time, it was mentioned to all be put in at once. We've talked to city staff, our engineer, as we described. We will be putting up a screening, a landscape screening, prior to the construction of the homes all at once. We will have, there's already a well on the property. We'll add some additional wells. All the landscaping, all the yards will all be irrigated with the well system, so to keep everything growing.
Thank you, Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to speak?
My name is Paula Callahan. I'm at 2356 Pitts Lane, and I just didn't want this hearing to close on the issues of traffic and water, because just want to make sure that the council is aware and taking special note that there is precedents that could be set here tonight. And there are other single-family homes on Pitts Lane with significant acreage that will be asking for this type of exception in the future. There's just no doubt about it. And so we would ask that you just leave it the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Callahan. Anyone else wishing to speak? right, seeing none, we'll close the public hearing and we'll consider for passage on first reading ordinance 17 OZ 32 to rezone an area along White Poplar Court to Planned Residential Development PRD District, Poplar Grove PRD. Mr. Huddleston, whoever wants to answer on drainage, we had several questions on water runoff and drainage.
Good evening again, Mayor. I think there were two elements to this. There was a question about Mr. Mattinson's property, and then there was a question about the impact of this development. I think Mr. Gordon has done some analysis on their proposal. Obviously, this subdivision was approved and constructed already. The infrastructure's in, permeable pavers on the road, but I think Mr. Gordon has some analysis and numbers he can share with us. What I will tell you is that I did visit with Mr. Mattinson several years ago, I think maybe shortly after he moved in. We reviewed the situation in his backyard. Those are very large lots in Mirabella. At the time the home was built, they really just raised up the pad to construct the home. They left the backyard lower than the rest of the lot, and certainly lower than the top of pipe that serves that lot. He has a very significant tree canopy in that area, and so our discussion focused around, one, it's private property, so the city's not able to spend resources to improve his private property to fill his lot. Two, I asked him about the importance of the trees that he has in his backyard, and he said they were very beneficial to help screen from Pitts Lane. And I said, well, you realize that if a couple feet of fill's brought in here, all those trees would have to come down. So we did have that discussion, and there was a discussion that a grading plan would be needed, and he'd need to carefully look at his lot and then the adjacent lots that also have water that drains across his lot. But we did talk about that, and really as a private issue there, it would be tough for the city to take any action on that property.
Does it come from the west, or from the east to the west? Is that the way it flows there?
The original low point on Pitts Lane, before the city reconstructed Pitts Lane, was at this location. So the drainage system and intervening drainage and all was headed to that area to begin with. When Mirabella was proposed, they extended a public drainage system to the right-of-way of Pitts Lane, the drainage easement that crosses his lot, and then they sized the pipes and constructed the balance of the drainage system through Mirabella to receive the runoff from that low point. When we rebuilt Pitts Lane, we merely replaced the existing culvert that was there. And tied our city street drainage into it. It's already moving there by ditch section primarily. This time maybe I'll ask Mr. Gordon just to touch a bit on the analysis they've done.
Thank you. Knowing that this was going to come up today at the meeting, I went back through and looked at the calculations related to the permeable paver roadway and also the permeable pavers in the driveways. Originally, we had calculated based on the roadway only, and that was enough stormwater treatment for the 17 houses at the square footage that we expected, the driveways that we expected to be built with those 17, and it was pretty even. When we consider also the permeable pavers for the driveways, we would be, if you converted that into what allowable acreage of property we could treat with the amount of roadway and driveways, we could do 9.5 acres, and this site is 7.2. So we have a little bit excess of treatment compared to the amount of impermeable surface that we're going to have. This is one of the items that came up during the original subdivision, was talking about this because it is a pilot project, but that's because of looking at utilities within the roadway, looking at using permeable pavers as a roadway that would then be become city property and have to be maintained. The city has used permeable pavers on site plan type projects successfully on school projects, and there have been several that have been used on private development projects. So the success of the stormwater part of the permeable pavers has been used on other projects. And this, to confirm, this does flow. Most of our site flows towards Pitts Lane, goes into the Pitts Lane stormwater system, down the street, and then flows onto the property of the resident that was questioning it.
So, Mayor, the permeable pavers that are used here, and it's been our experience with those when we've used them, because of the nature of that pavement base and the nature of how it manages the stormwater, we actually, in a lot of cases, see reductions in runoff from properties versus their original runoff rates. While this is just the roadway, that's not quite the case there, but the other thing that it does is it provides some storage, some very long-term storage, and so what water does make it off of this property into the Pitts Lane system, it'll be delayed much later in the storm event, and so would have less impact on the peak runoff from the property than before. We found them to be very beneficial in managing and mitigating the off-site stormwater impacts such as this.
Mr. Whitaker, I think we had questions on this development's coming through as a planned residential development, so the question was setting a precedent on zoning, and then what the comprehensive 2035 plan the land use plans on how that ties in.
Well, a couple of items, Mayor, that came up was one, the plan development. A few points I'd like to make and try to cover these. One of which is with the plan development versus straight zoning, you kind of know what you get. They have to give a in-depth plan book, shows the house types, construction, minimum sizes. There's a lot more detail goes in, and that is actually the zoning for the property. If in fact that is changed or deviated, they would have to come back, go through Plan Commission and City Council to get the approval to change it and to public hearings. So as opposed to straight zoning, if it's RS-15 lot, only the subdivision restrictions that the developer puts down, which are enforceable not by the city, but just by the developer or the landowners in the development, is kind of the difference between the planned developments. The 2035 plan that we adopted by last week talks about density, talks about growth in our city. As we all know, our city has grown for the last 30 years. It is going to continue to grow. We are a very desirable city to live in. People want to come here, move here for our schools, and basically we are going to experience continued growth. And one of the things they pointed out is the limitations of our land. Our state laws have changed. We can no longer forcibly annex. Property has to be annexed into our city by request of the owner of the property. So as the availability for us to go out and annex in large parcels of land is pretty much not existing unless somebody requests that. So taking that in consideration in the 2035 analysis, basically what they come up is said that we're going to have to consider redeveloping older parts. That's in part why we did the Highland study and the Bottom study for redevelopment or downtown areas. Again, you've heard me request about Broad Street, redeveloping of that. Some other things that they talked about in 2035 was increased density. First and foremost, the days of going out and cutting up 3/4 acre lots we will not be able to sustain growth, and it's cost prohibitive. As land values go up, as land gets more and more valuable resource in our city, you can't go out and basically cut land up into large tracts anymore. And by and large, we're seeing that people, there's a sector of the community that does not like large tracts. They don't want to mow a 3/4 acre lot. I myself are getting there. But we're seeing a trend to where people want smaller lots. They want homeowner association where things are actually maintained for them. This is, in fact, one of those. Mr. Lance, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, what, as far as precedence goes, I mean, look, I'll tell you, this is, for me, a pretty nice development. I mean, the addition of, we're talking about 17, that's the old plat. The RS-15 would actually allow 21 homes that could be 1,200-foot siding, all siding starter homes. I mean, without us looking at it, never again, there could be 21 homes that are, so somebody brought up the idea about, property values and that sort of thing. And, we, as it is a bulk zone, I'm just trying to put this into kind of more layman's terms here. The way it is right now, there is zero control over somebody coming in and building 21 homes. And so the question to ask is whether or not it's worth about 10 extra homes here in order to have a whole lot of clarity and what looks to be a really nice development to me. I think the water issue, the traffic issue, those have fairly satisfactory answers. But from a precedent standpoint, Mr. Anthony mentioned something about a range of density. The upper side of that was 3.5, and by the Planning Commission meeting minutes and by what was in our package, it said 3.4, but it's actually 4.4.
Yes, sir.
What I don't even know where that range came from.
That range, I believe he's referring to, is actually from our land use map from the 2035 plan. Is the 2035 plan? We looked at the city, and they went through and made recommendations for. Now, again, it's not a zoning map. They just went and made recommendations for typical land use for those areas.
That would get us to 26. I think I did the math on that a minute ago. If we were looking at 3.5, what would actually be 3.5 units per acre? Is that what the?
Those are 3.5.
I think that gets us to 26 units. So, we're talking about maybe a total of 5 units here. I think what some of the neighbors are saying is, maybe we're on this slippery slope or whatever. I would look at you guys and tell you, this is maybe the first rezoning that I've seen that's actually detached homes in a really long time. It's either been apartments or townhomes. You guys saw what was here just before you guys, which backs up to Northwoods, which was 7 units per acre, not 4.4. And they're certainly not going to be $500,000 pieces of property. So this one's a tough one for me. I don't want to go outside the ranges too far, but I like the development, frankly. I think it's not going to bring down prices on your homes. I think it's going to probably increase them. But I don't know. I wanted to make sure, what kind of precedents are we setting before we even approve the land use map, which we haven't yet, we're going to start making variances from it. When it says we ought to be at 3.5 per acre, we're going to be going to 4.5. Is that something that's within ranges that we typically vary from ranges? If that makes any sense.
My opinion on the density on the property, in my opinion, is it may not be specifically within the current land use map or they're proposed, but I think what we've seen down Pitts Lane, and this has kind of evolved over several years, is that Pitts Lane is a little bit under a mile long. Several large acreage tracts were out there, and what we're seeing is those people are selling those large acreage tracts, and they're coming in requesting. In the past, most of those requests have been for RS-15 lots. But what I think the trend and what you'll see is in the future that people will come in, and they have a right to come in, and if they decide to sell their property and request a development, I think you will see higher densities, maybe not higher than this, but I think you're going to see, and I'm not trying to say this is going to be a pattern. Who knows what the property will sell for? Who knows what they'll come in and request? But basically, do I think this is out of character? No, I don't. I feel that it's a quality development. And typically, when somebody comes in with a planned development, we look to them to say, what are you bringing to the table? If you're wanting to increase density, then what are you giving in return for that? And in this case, I think they stepped up. Again, it's one of the only paver streets that we're going to have in the city that I know of today. If you go look at the development or the homes that are in the plan book, or actually go out and look at them, you'll see that the developer met the requirements of the request that we had, including the screen. And one thing I do want to point out is that we did have neighborhood meetings on this. In fact, because of the concern that I knew the residents may have, also asked the home developer to go and knock on doors for the surrounding areas. I think he personally went out and did that, or his representative went out and knocked on doors to let people know. Now there's a range. I mean, we can't go a mile down the street, or have an expectation of that. With the zoning signs that we put out in all the publications, we try to make sure that everybody's aware of what's going on. One of the other points I would like to make is they were talking about the traffic. When Pitts Lane was redeveloped, it was done as a 3-lane cross-section. And Pitts Lane was actually designed and upgraded to carry traffic from Northfield to DeJarnett Lane. And DeJarnett Lane was actually upgraded to carry more traffic as well. It actually connects 2 5-lane roads. Those roads are designed to carry additional traffic as well as the Pitts Lane. It is a 3-lane cross-section road.
Can you tell me, I just looked at the map, can you tell me also one other question? I'm sorry, this will be it. McKinley Place, I've been by there a bunch. It doesn't seem like is it RS-15 or was it a PRD? Do you happen to recall? I mean, they look
I don't recall.
Awful
It's
small
RS-15.
lots.
Mr. Blomley says it's RS-15.
It is still RS-15? Okay. I'm just looking at my phone satellite here, but I'm trying to get some confirmation.
And some of those lots in Bear Branch, I believe, when they were developed because of the flood elements in the back, some of those lots are quite large, but the back of those properties, and we find this sometimes in larger lots, that you can't build in those areas. So it just becomes a larger part of the lot at the back of it. And I think some of those on Pitts you'll find that are larger than RS-15, but that's not developable due to the flood elevations and what have you.
All right, any other questions?
As we, we're shifting to PRDs, and that does allow the reasonable expectation for what's going to happen by the developer. But my inclination is to be concerned about the density of the development, and don't let that get too far out, because that's really another control that we have, is the density that we're allowing. And I look at this development, and I look at how close some of these homes are to each other, and I realize that's an economic thing that's driving the density of the housing. But I'm just concerned that we allow these additional homes and we don't allow for the aesthetics or some of the impact on what Mr. Tucker was talking about, our infrastructure. And we always talk about being behind the curve with our infrastructure. Some of these things I'd love to see something to deal with the Pitts Lane situation. If we're going to have this blank canvas of property out there and what's going to happen, somebody needs to be thinking and having the Pitts Lane improvement on the radar. And I couldn't find it when I was looking for what we were going to do at Pitts Lane. I guess I'm a little concerned about, I love the scale and the character of the development, and appreciate the developer and those people looking at a high-end development, but I am concerned about the density of that, of the PRD. It looks like we're packing homes in there. Even though they're nice homes, we're packing them in.
And another thing we find out, Ms. Shea, and that is true, we want to be cognizant of the density and how that affects infrastructure, but also some of this is lifestyle. Again, it gets back to, I guarantee you the developer is not going to continue to build that style if it's not going to sell. And what we're seeing is that lifestyle, the empty nesters don't want all the maintenance, and we're seeing this trend. And typically market will always dictate what can be built and what can be sold. And we are seeing it. There is a market out there for it. And again, I think it gets back to lifestyle.
And one point
well.
about the pavers, which I just want to have to make this point. On the front end of pavers, it gives you benefit, but it's the maintenance of those pavers. Somebody in the HOA, you've got to maintain that, or you lose everything that you thought you were going to gain by them being obstructed, or so pavers look good on the front end and they function normally well on the front end, but it's as you get 10 years, 5, 10 years down the pike, and a paver's not maintained, and you've lost all what you thought you were going to gain with the runoff. So by using pavers, so I just make sure we keep a handle on that. If pavers, and we're encouraging that, and that's a good move on the front end of it. But I'm concerned that we've seen some instances where they haven't been maintained, and then all of a sudden you've lost all your.
That is correct. They have to be maintenance, and if not, debris will clog them. So they have to have a maintenance. But all of our roads need maintenance from time to time, as we hear.
Mr. Shacklett, I might take this opportunity to just come up and mention a little bit about the plan for maintenance on the pavers there. If the plan is approved as it's presented, the street becomes a private street, so the city would not be maintaining those. However, the developer will sign a maintenance agreement with the city. We'll record that, and it'll specify the required maintenance on those pavers, as well as any other of the stormwater elements. That's pretty typical for any new development today that includes stormwater management facilities on their property. We're getting those maintenance agreements at the time the project's wrapping up, and those are recorded, and they're enforceable by the city, and we have some enforcement mechanisms to bring that to pass. The other thing I'll tell you is that paver technology is really improving. We did a couple of demonstration projects in the city this summer, earlier this year, where there were some areas that the pavers had lost their permeability, if you will, and we were able to go back in. A paving company came in and demonstrated to us how that permeability could be restored. We have that capability for the city properties. We have that capability in-house. It's within our street department and our street sweeping technology, but that same technology is available to the private sector as well. That could, if there were some events that happened where permeability is lost there, it's able to be restored by street sweepers, and then replacing some of the paving base material that you take out with the sweeping. So that's a couple of, if that might help you with the use of the pavers.
Can we look at what improvements need to be made long term, at least get Pitts Lane improvements on the?
Well, this section of Pitts Lane was actually on our major thoroughfare plan and funded for improvements to a 3-lane curb and gutter section probably about 10 years ago. And then right on the heels of that, we approved a Jarnett Lane for widening to 5 lanes. So we have invested quite extensively already in the area. Lascassas Pike would be on the state's list. Pitts Lane south of here, which was taking you across Northfield, is also on a major thoroughfare plan for improvements. Both ends of Pitts Lane are signalized intersections. That's normally one of the things we would hear from the traffic standpoint. Just add a signal. We have signals at both ends of Pitts Lane to allow this traffic to exit. And I think the residents are correct that there are times of the day, especially during the school peak, when there's some heavier traffic on Pitts Lane, that certainly turning against traffic would be tough. Getting out of the neighborhood to turn left when school flow is perhaps to the right. Those are, but normally the signals are going to provide gaps in there so that there's an opportunity for you to exit out of that most of the time in a reasonable time frame.
But if this is the horizon of some of those lots being considered for development in that area, then it seems to be time to look at it again.
Sure, and there are a lot of roads, Mr. Shacklet, maybe this is what you're alluding to. There are a lot of roads that we started out with 3 lanes, and now they're 5 and 7, and who knows where that ends. But what we do know is that there are some other road networks and some other improvements, but there's also additional growth in the area. I think the neighbors have mentioned that. There's some undeveloped tracks or some larger tracks on Pitts Lane. And so there will be, no doubt, some pressures on that. And we review the roadways and the traffic counts and that network from time to time, and we'll be on your agenda in August with our next version of the major thoroughfare plan. But leading up to that, reviewing and analyzing the traffic counts and where there are hot spots, that all is part of it. And so that'd be something for this administration and the administrations for the city of Murfreesboro to come to continually evaluate our road systems.
Mr. Ellison, that thing, I used to run on Pitts Lane when it didn't have sidewalks and there was no shoulder, so right next to Mr. Ian's house, you would literally, when you ran at night, have to be careful, because if you went off the shoulder there, you're going down 8-10 feet. I mean, that's the way it used to be there. But the option, and I see the residents that are sitting out there, and we're talking about traffic. The next option on Pitts Lane from a 3-lane would be to a 5-lane.
That's correct.
And I don't think any of the residents on Pitts Lane would be, for that size of a street to go to a 5-lane. I mean, is that what we would, on our major thoroughfare plan, do we see that as a 5-lane road?
We don't see it currently as a 5-lane road. It's not recommended to be upgraded to a 5-lane road with this version. I think what I was suggesting to Mr. Shacklet is we're constantly evaluating those. One idea is the other roadway networks in the area can help alleviate those hot spots. And I think you'll see when we bring the major thoroughfare plan to you, it's not just one plan that helps with that, but it's the combination of mobility and connectivity with some increased capacity in certain areas that help us address those hot spots.
I think we talked about this the other night. I think where we talk about learning curves, what we've learned is it's better to not put schools on major arterials if possible. Like Overall Creek, we now have it tucked away off of a 5-lane highway. But, the issue, in my opinion, with Pitts Lane is not necessarily the traffic that's generated by Pitts Lane by the people who live there. It's all of us who use Pitts Lane as a cut-through to be able to get to Northfield. And the only other alternative to get to Northfield other than Pitts Lane is Alexander Boulevard, through the Northwood subdivision, which
Correct.
We all get complaints on traffic running through Alexander. So, I hope with our major thoroughfare plan that we're getting ready to talk about, there are some of these alternative roads that we're going to be able to discuss to alleviate, some of the traffic we have. I mean, I was sitting here when we widened DeJarnette Lane, and we had to
That's
talk
correct.
about Haynes Drive that gets almost 15 or 16,000 traffics a day. So I mean, there's a lot of discussions on road networks that'll have to be discussed.
The people on Haynes actually don't want a 3-lane road coming through there because they're concerned about the increased traffic. And to kind of follow up on what you guys are saying, I think the 2035 plan teaches us one thing, and that's that we're going to have to live within our boundaries. And Murfreesboro's the 10th fastest growing city in the country. The reason for that is the quality of life. And we've got great schools. It's a fairly safe city to be in. It has a good economy right now. There's small towns all around Murfreesboro that come to Murfreesboro to shop because of the amenities that we have within this city. And so when you look at the city and what's going on here, the question is, do we want to build more homes? Or the other question is, do we want to build more apartments? Because people are coming, and there's either going to be affordable housing for them to live in single-family homes, or they're going to not be able to afford the housing. And if you can't afford housing, then you rent. And if you rent, then that means we're going to, you can either turn the angle towards Antioch, or you can turn the angle towards Brentwood, I guess, of saying larger homes that are more expensive homes is an asset to your community. it certainly helps the property values, and from a governmental side, that's a good thing. But when we look at the city is growing. We definitely have a huge demand for housing. I don't consider these low-income housing by any mean. They're nice homes, and I think it was mentioned earlier, Mr. Whitaker kind of went down this road, but the kids that are coming out of college now and the younger folks are saying that they don't want to mow grass, and they don't want to do yard maintenance, and they don't want these big lots and stuff. And they may change their attitude once they have children and stuff, but I think some of them will, but some of them won't, because they like the freedom and the mobility of being able to move around and work where they want to, but not have so much home maintenance and upkeep. And I think that's when you downsize your lot, that's what you're doing. It's really more about the quality of the product than it is about the size of the lot that it sets on. I know there was concern at one time about Georgetown and Forest Oaks, which at that time Murfreesboro wasn't used to townhomes. We thought everybody needed a ranch home, and it needed to be sitting on a half acre or better. And everybody said, well, these are going to hurt the value of our properties. Well, here we are 30 or 40 years later, and we look back at those properties, and they've been maintained extremely well by the homeowners associations, and they've actually had the opposite effect, is they've been maintained even at a higher standard than what the single-family homes surrounding them have been. So I do think that density is part of one of the things that we're going to have to accept if we're going to continue living in Murfreesboro. Murfreesboro cannot spread outwards. The legislature has said, no, you're not going to have urban sprawl. Last week in the Planning Commission meeting, we sat there and listened to all the people in the county saying, when is big enough big enough? We're tired of you sprawling out across the county. Well, the legislator listened to them, and they've now pretty well fixed our boundaries as to what they are. Unless somebody voluntarily wants to be annexed, there's no annexation taking place. So you got to look at the property rights of the person who owns the property. They have the right to develop it if it falls within whatever zoning that they can apply for, get accepted. So I think this is a quality project. I think that the concerns with the water have kind of been answered. The concerns about the traffic, we've got lights at each end of Thompson Lane or Pitts Lane, and at the end of Pitts Lane we've got some control of the traffic. It's not like you're having to pull out into a roadway that doesn't have a signalized intersection. So all that said, unless anybody else has a comment or something they'd like to say, I'm going to go ahead and move for approval on this project.
Did we answer the question about the buffer, the 5 properties that are on Patriot Drive, the buffer between those 5 properties? Someone?
What happened at Planning Commission was the general concept of we would do rear yard landscaping, and there would be some perimeter landscaping, and that it would be done along with each house. That's been now defined by Planning Commission and staff helping us with that the landscaping will go in at the time when we begin the project. So the first C of O for the houses, certificate of occupancy, will be tied to that. And then the actual landscape screen materials are what we've got shown on 4A. That's defined, and that'll be around the perimeter. And we will be keeping as much of the perimeter trees as we can. All of the tree line trees that are on the property line, we're keeping all of those, of course, because they're partly on us and partly on the neighbors. There are some trees that are fully on our side. We'll keep as much of that as we can, and then add these new trees in the landscape screen.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. All right, we have a motion.
I'll second it.
Motion and a second. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Vice Mayor Scales Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance. Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. All right, pursuant to Resolution 17R PH 33, adopted by the City Council on June 15, 2017, conduct a public hearing and consider a proposed amendment to rezone approximately 43.2 acres along Veterans Parkway and Vaughn Road from single-family residential 15 district to highway commercial CH district. Joy Pratt Horde et al. Applicants. Notice of said public hearing was published in the July 3, 2017 issue of a local newspaper.
Good evening, Mayor McFarland and members of council. Our next public hearing tonight is for a tract that is located along both the east and west sides of Veterans Parkway. You'll see it on the map before you, colored in orange. This was property that you took action to annex with the larger West Park property, which is located just to the east of the subject property. If you'll recall, back when the West Park was being annexed, we surveyed a number of the various property owners in the vicinity of the West Park property to see if they were interested in annexation, knowing the impact that the West Park development would have on their properties. And Ms. Horde and the McCullough family were interested in annexation and very quickly made a request to annex the property. City Council annexed their property along with the park property. They've requested commercial highway zoning for their property. It's located on, as I mentioned, on both the east and west sides of Veterans Parkway, directly to the north of the Veterans Parkway 840 interchange. And you'll see right here, directly to the east, is the West Park property. To the north are a couple more parcels that were annexed at the same time and are currently zoned RS-15. We actually have received a zoning request for the parcel that's on the corner of Burnt Knob Road and Veterans Parkway, and that will be going before the Planning Commission next month. The map is a little bit outdated. You'll see Mr. McDonald's property across Veterans Parkway, which was rezoned to commercial highway and commercial fringe just about a month ago. His property, when this map was made, the rezoning was not finalized. At any rate, I believe what the applicants envision for the property is that it's a location that's appropriate for commercial activity, interstate-oriented commercial activity, as we expect a lot of visitors to the park property, both local and out of town, and that this would be an appropriate location for interstate-oriented commercial services such as convenience markets, restaurants, and other commercial, retail, food service facilities that would serve the many visitors to the West Park property. The future land use map in the Murfreesboro 2035 Comprehensive Plan depicts a future land use classification of business park for the east side of Veterans Parkway, and this property is bisected by Veterans Parkway. It was all one parcel, and it remains one parcel, but the construction of Veterans Parkway, actually the right-of-way was acquired right down the middle of the property. So it recommends business park for that area, and on the west side of Veterans Parkway, it recommends suburban residential. Of course, those designations were recommended by our consultants before the West Park was envisioned for the property to the west. So staff is in agreement with the applicant that those classifications no longer seem appropriate for the property. And the Murfreesboro 2035 document, which was adopted by the Planning Commission at last week's Planning Commission meeting, it's a living document. It's an advisory document, and it's also a living document, I think, that we envision on a quarterly or an annual basis, bringing back amendments to the map to the Planning Commission when there are zoning requests that the Planning Commission and City Council endorse that may not be fully consistent with the 2035 Comprehensive Plan. But with the West Park property, staff believes that this is an appropriate location for the commercial highway zoning. The applicants actually, when we first met with them, suggested light industrial, and we steered them away from that. We felt that would be missing an opportunity for the opportunity for commercial development along this corridor. And so they did make the application to Commercial Highway for this property. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. I believe Mr. Clyde Roundtree, representing the property owners, are here, and Ms. Horde, the property owner, is here if you have any questions for her as well. Thank you.
Mr. Ballmer, we had a lot of discussion when, we had Mr. McDonald came through several months ago about the council talked about the intersection, and, obviously we're getting ready to spend a significant amount of taxpayer dollars on a property adjacent to this. Has there been discussion with the applicant about some of the restrictions that Mr. McDonald put on his property about being consistent and asking that those be placed on this property as well?
We have not. Restrictive covenants are something that we typically do not try to. I think it's something. There's something that can be put forth as a good faith effort.
Sure.
But we generally do not put that forward as something that is the zoning for the property is either appropriate or it's not appropriate. And many times the applicants will put forth a good faith effort with restrictive covenants. But it's certainly up to the council if they wish to ask the applicants to voluntarily do something along the lines of what Mr. McDonald did. One thing that I will mention is since Mr. McDonald's property was rezoned, we did amend the zoning ordinance, and you'll recall that warehousing and distribution was a permitted use in the commercial highway zone up until just about a month or two ago. City Council amended the ordinance, the zoning ordinance, to prohibit that use in the commercial highway zone. So that is one use that I believe was in the list that Mr. McDonald restricted from his property that is no longer permitted by zoning on the property.
A commercial highway, just for example, could a truck stop go on this property?
Such as like a pilot?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Matthew, you said that generally the city does not enforce restrictive covenants, nor do we have the authority to. But we generally like to see those in place because when they're there, it helps protect the neighbors of the property. In this particular case, our park, we are the neighbors of this property. So I do think that if there were restrictive covenants in place, it would be advantageous to us as their neighbor because would an adult store be acceptable in this zoning?
No, sir.
It's not. But a truck stop is.
Yes, sir.
A junkyard?
No.
Salvage yard?
No.
Do we take those out?
No, those are only allowed in industrial zoning districts. Wrecker storage yards are permitted.
Yeah.
Those would be like a tow yard, but like an auto salvage yard would only be allowed in industrial zones.
I don't have it.
And wrecker yards are in many instances where vehicles are left there for much shorter periods of time than like a salvage yard where someone goes and mines for parts or buys parts.
Could a sawmill or something like that, or would that have to be industrial?
I don't believe so. I believe that's more industrial.
Well, let me go about this from a different direction. Do you remember, because I don't remember what all the restrictive covenants were on the McDonald's property, do you remember what some of those were?
I believe there was truck stop, warehousing and distribution, wrecker service storage yard. Don't recollect the other specific uses that were on that list. There were about 8 or 9 of them, I would say.
Yeah, I really feel like for consistency's sake that it would be advantageous to us to at least see if there's any interest in going that direction before we make a decision on this. I think that I think the property should be in city limits where it is. It's next to the park. I think there's excellent opportunities for the property to be zoned commercial highway and be advantageous not only to the park but to the area and the neighborhood out there. Having said that, I personally would like to at least go look at the opportunities of. Clyde, do you know what the restrictions were on the last property?
Clyde Roundhill, Steel Engineering. Mr. Smotherman, I don't know exactly the restrictions, but I know the intention of these restrictions. And I think this falls under a little bit of a different category, and I may be wrong, but I think that what was brought up with Mr. McDonald's property was specifically that it had a real gateway element to it, that there would be a perception from 840 from the interstate that would be a receiving element. And I think that Mr. McDonald agreed with that he said, we didn't want our truck stop as our first impression. I think the fact that this is off that main corridor of 840, I think that was the motivation behind the restrictions, Mr. Smotherman. But I at the same time, Mrs. Horde would like to know more about those exactly. So she'd like to know more before she could commit to that. But we don't know if that's going to be I don't think that'll be a deal breaker. But I just want to make sure we remember that the intention, I think, originally was to make sure the first thing you didn't see when you came to Murfreesboro was a truck stop. And that really kind of catalyzed some changes in the zoning ordinance. Again, I don't think this fits the same criteria, but that's kind of the history.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's probably not currently as direct a route into Murfreesboro as what the other property was, but I do think it's contiguous to the same interstate system going through there, and it just, with the open property that they have around them, I have to believe at some point those people are going to, with Veterans Parkway continuing to develop, I have to believe that there will be a lot of growth and development in this area. I don't think it's going to stop. City limits is going to stop at that line for an extremely long time. So I think just as a precautionary thing that we should investigate that and look into it before we make a decision on this. So I'm going to move for deferral of this one. Okay, yeah, go ahead and have a public hearing.
All right. We'll now hold the public hearing. Anyone wishing to speak for or against, please come to the podium. Okay. Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. And we'll now consider the passage on first reading, ordinance 17 OZ 33 to rezone an area along Veterans Parkway and Vaughn Road to Highway Commercial CH District.
Just for clarification, Mayor and council members, the restrictive covenants that were put on the McDonald property, if we provided those to Ms. Horde and the other ownership members, were those uses generally acceptable as far as the list of ones that were prohibited?
They were when we approved the McDonald property, so I'm assuming they would still be. That would still apply.
So if we gave those to her and they had those drawn up, if they were acceptable to the applicants, at that point, would the council be okay with us bringing that back again for first reading?
Yeah, if we defer it, that's what will happen, right?
Yeah, this isn't a time deferral. They can bring it back to the next meeting if they want to, as far as I'm concerned, as long as, we've looked at those options and made every effort to protect that area as much as we can.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I would say, it's 40 plus acres, and, I think the city, our initial estimates are extremely high on what we're looking for our park property, and that park's going to be there for longer than most of us will be here. So I would really ask the applicant to think about that when they start going through looking at those uses, and really think about, the McDonald property was across the other side of the interstate, but to think that you're going to have a park right next to commercial highway, what uses are okay? I would argue we've got parks where we've got, there's a shopping center that's next to a park, and that's fine, but look at those uses and make sure that would fit in on what you'd want to see on next to a ball field.
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, I'm going to just say it this way. If the uses, I want to respect their property rights. I actually tried to reach out to speak with Ms. Horde before this meeting to talk about this, but, if the uses don't turn out the way that I think are appropriate, and we do zone it that way as a board here, I'll be substantially less likely to want to invest $25 or $30 million in the property that's next to it. I mean, I'll just say it that way. And so when you're looking at those uses, I think just what he was trying to say is I couldn't get it pulled up. Something's wrong with my laptop here, but, it's a substantial list, of what's under commercial highway. It is, it's real long. And so, a bulk zoning like that, as we just got through talking about in the last hearing, is, any of it could happen. A gravel parking lot with trucks parked on it, that kind of stuff is what is going through.
Gravel would not be permitted.
Okay.
Hard desolate surface.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you get the idea, right?
I do.
It goes through, and then is that really,
Pavers.
We'll be glad to sit down with the applicants and just go through the whole list of commercial highway and see what they're comfortable with and bring back something to the city council for your review.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. All right, we have a motion for deferral.
Move for deferral.
Second.
Ms. Wright, go call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Pursuant to Resolution 17 RPH 34 adopted by the City Council on June 15, 2017, will conduct a public hearing to consider adoption of a plan of services for an annexation of approximately 400 linear feet of Emory Road, which have been proposed to be annexed to the City of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. City of Murfreesboro Engineering Department applicant notice of said public hearing was published in the July 3, 2017 issue of a local newspaper. Mr. Ballman.
Thank you, Mayor McFarland. There's a small segment of Emory Road that we should have annexed back when we annexed the adjacent property to the west. There's a church located here right on the corner of Osborne and Emory, and then there were two lots that were developed. We annexed this back in 2006. Had a little bit of a different policy back then with regard to the annexation of adjacent rights-of-way. Now, our thought process and our policy is more along the lines of annex the right-of-way in front of properties. It's appropriate to have the city control the property that is the right-of-way that is directly in front of development within the city. So we have a 400-foot segment of Emory Road that goes down from the intersection of Osborne Lane to the right-of-way that was annexed with the Pebble Creek subdivision. Two lots have been developed, this one and this one. Those lots, when they were platted, there was right-of-way dedicated. So actually a portion of the right-of-way of Emory Road, because 5 feet of additional right-of-way was dedicated, because of that right-of-way dedication, some of the right-of-way is actually in the city, some of it's in the county. We feel it's a good idea to go ahead and get this, the entire right-of-way of Emory Road and in front of the existing city limits right here in the city limits. And that's why the City of Murfreesboro Engineering Department is the applicant on this. They've brought this before us today. I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. The Planning Commission did unanimously recommend approval of this annexation petition and plan of services.
Any questions? All right, we'll need to conduct a public hearing on the plan of services for and the annexation of approximately 400 linear feet of Emory Road, City of Murfreesboro Engineering Department applicant, 2017-507. Anyone wishing to speak for or against, please come to the podium. Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing and we'll consider for adoption Resolution 17 RPS 34 to adopt a plan of services for approximately 400 linear feet of Emory Road, City of Murfreesboro Engineering Department applicant.
Move for approval.
Second.
Motion second, Ms. Wright.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
All right, we'll now need to hold a public hearing for that's all we'll need to do. Correct? We've got consider for adoption to annex approximately 400 linear feet of Emory Road and to incorporate the same within the corporate boundaries of the City of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. City of Murfreesboro Engineering Department applicant. Sorry about that.
So move.
We've already had the public hearing on the annexation.
So move.
Motion second, Ms. Wright.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Pursuant to Resolution 17 RPH 35 adopted by the City Council on June 15, 2017, we'll conduct a public hearing to consider a proposed amendment to rezone approximately 6.11 acres along Jackson Allen Drive and Suzanne Landon Drive from planned commercial development PCD District to Planned Residential Development PRD District, the Villas at Regal Square PRD. Landquester applicant 2017-417. Notice of the said public hearing was published in the July 3rd issue of a local newspaper.
Thank you, Mayor McFarland. The subject property is a part of the Regal Square planned commercial development. And Regal Square was zoned as a planned commercial development about 10 years ago. There's been not a whole lot of movement in the development of Regal Square. Of course, the infrastructure's in, but very few of the lots have actually been built out. There's a vet's office right here on the corner of Jackson Allen and Memorial. There's a 2-tenant commercial building right on the other corner of Jackson Allen and Memorial. There's a daycare here, small office building here. The remaining 12 lots, are vacant, and they have been vacant for a number of years. The front lots along Memorial Boulevard were zoned for what was called in the book as quote-unquote commercial, and the balance of the lots, including the ones that are a part of this rezoning request, were zoned as office specialty shop lots. And what we've seen all around town is areas that are specifically zoned for office uses seem to have little viability. We rarely see any new rezoning requests to Office General, and we rarely see any development on land that's already zoned Office General. I think what we find is that most of the office uses and office buildings either want to be in commercial areas or they want to be located in commercial buildings. And, and it's not unusual to see financial offices and other types of offices that are located in retail strip centers, for example. So with these lots having sat vacant for a number of years, the developer has requested a change in zoning from planned commercial district to planned residential district for a townhome development called the Villas at Regal Square. These would all be owner-occupied units. This would not be an apartment complex. They would be owner-occupied units via a horizontal property regime, and so kind of as a way to salvage what is left of this development. Mr. Roundtree will get up in a moment and give a brief PowerPoint presentation. The Planning Commission did hold a public hearing on this matter on June the 7th and unanimously recommended its approval. The land use map contained in the Murfreesboro 2035 Comprehensive Plan, which was adopted last week by the Planning Commission, recommends that the subject property develop as business park. And I think that was more of a function of what it was already zoned for. The consultants in areas that were already zoned a certain way wanted to try to be consistent with the existing zoning so as not to recommend something that went against the current zoning or land development rights of the property owners. So, but with this property being having been zoned for offices, but having sat dormant for a number of years, the applicants are requesting a change in zoning that would not be consistent with the comprehensive land use plan. But as I mentioned, it's a flexible document, and we will look to bring any deviations from that land use map back to the Planning Commission for their approval on a regular basis. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. And Mr. Roundtree, as I mentioned, has a brief PowerPoint presentation.
Sure.
Mayor, Commissioners, my name is Clyde Roundtree, Hudson Steel Engineering. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you Regal Square, the villages at Regal Square. And as I mentioned in the Planning Commission meeting, this is an exciting project. We feel like it's a great use of some land that's been laid vacant for quite some time. And I'm here representing Mr. Larry Gilliland with Landquester Development, so there may be some questions you may have specifically for him. But as I mentioned, Mr. Gilliland has made an excellent decision on this piece of property. We feel like this is an appropriate use, primarily because its proximity to 231 as far as the type of development we'd like to do, but also the fact that it'll be a good transition between the commercial and the existing residential that go beyond this particular piece of property. Just some highlights real quickly. It is a 6-acre site, great proximity to 231 on the north side of Murfreesboro. as I mentioned, it's situated between neighborhood businesses and single-family large lots. And there's already an existing street, a public street. It's really nice. It's got curb and gutter. It's got street lights, so it's in good shape. It's ready for development. The key to the existing photos that I want you to realize is there's a really substantial existing buffer along the property lines. It is our intention to keep those trees in place. We can never guarantee it just because of grading concerns, but it is highly desirable that they should stay in good shape. I think one of the neighbors is here that's on the back portion of the property. That picture in the top left-hand corners, a large tract of land, but that's a buffer that actually has a double row of evergreen trees. As far as the overall site characteristics, just a few things I want to mention there. It's basically 42 lots that we're looking for, 42 homes. Let's come up here as well. And their unit density is 6.87 per acre. Minimum square footage is 1,600 square feet per home. They'll all be 3-bedroom units. And as Matthew mentioned, the horizontal property regime will be the type of ownership. And then the city staff really wanted to work with us on parking, making sure that in this situation there were ample parking. But we're excited because it's all rear entry garages, rear entry parking lots. So I think the impact on Jackson Allen Drive and Susan Landon will be beautiful. I think it'll have a really nice streetscape kind of feel to it and a real intimate scale. So we're really excited about the end product on this one. General architecture, varied roof lines, alternating fronts, dormers, various types of dormers, front porches. We wanted to make sure that the units had a wraparound corner. The city staff's really coaching us on ends of building, making sure there's windows on the ends of building, make sure if there's a porch that it does have a semblance of turning the corner of the structure. We do have a few scenarios where we're going to see this, basically the end of the actual unit, so we want to make sure we address the street from those end units. One more picture of the architecture, and again, it's 100% masonry products, whether that be hardy board, brick, or stone. I think I mentioned all those. Again, it has an upscale appearance, and I'd like to mention that because I think it's important. The commercial development on the front end of Jackson Allen Road Drive is it's businesses, but the businesses have a real residential scale. I've learned since the last commission meeting that was by design, so it has a real neat residential scale already. So we feel like the architecture that we're proposing will be very fitting with what is already in existence. As I mentioned, we'll try to do our best to preserve the buffers, but we'd also like to introduce a real strong foundation planting with this particular product. And the reason is that we want to really address the road, make sure it has a great appearance from the street, and also introduce street trees, kind of alternating street trees on both sides of the road. There'll be a sidewalk on both sides of the road as well. And as I mentioned, the amenity center that is a part of our package, I think that's my last slide, but I'll show it on this particular piece because it is behind, it's kind of centrally located, but it's behind the townhomes on the back portion of the site, and it'll be a pavilion with a playground area, and then there is a dog park, but we separated that from the playground area, and that's over by the retention pond on the northern side of the property. And with that in mind, if there's any question you may have about this particular project, I think, again, Mr. Gilliland's done a great job in making a great decision. It's been great working with city staff on trying to make sure what we're proposing is consistent with the character and quality that already exists, and we feel like the area is appropriate for this type of development, as well as a good transition between the commercial development and the private residences. So I'm available for any questions you may have any, and Mr. Gilliland, as I mentioned, is here as well if you need to ask him any specific questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll now open the public hearing for this zoning change. Anyone wishing to speak for or against, please come to the podium.
Mr. Bauer, I know you've got something to say.
Well, thank you. My name is Matt Bauer. My wife and I live at 198 Cedarview Drive, and we've been there nearly 40 years. And the only thing I'd like to mention is that our access from our property to 231 was cut off when the Regal Square was built. And the city engineering department told me it was a substandard road. what that has done, when you cut that off, we can't get through to Highway 231 on Cedarview. We do have to go through Regal Square Apartments. So this has made a problem for us. We had an offer a couple of years ago for our property, but when they saw the substandard road, they were no longer interested. So it's a little, as you can see on the map, it's not very long, 100-some feet. It's what we have to reach from the Suzanne Landon, goes to Cedarview, turn right, and then come to our property. Now, I don't foresee that the city is going to be doing anything with that road, because eventually this Suzanne Landon will hopefully connect to Osborne Lane and perhaps somewhere across toward Compton Road in that direction, or Brent Mead. But I do want to mention and point out that what they've done to us is make our property less valuable, because the access has been the quality of the access has been greatly decreased. So I want to point that out to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak for or against? All right, seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. We'll consider for passage on first reading ordinance 17-OZ35 to rezone an area along Jackson Island Drive and Suzanne Landon Drive to plan a residential development district, the villas at Regal Square. I'm going to be abstaining from this vote. I have no financial interest, but the owner is a close friend of mine, and I feel like it's better just to abstain from it.
Mr. Roundtree, could I ask you a question, please? In our notes, it mentions the exterior materials, we brick, stone, and fiber cement siding. What does that mean, and is there a minimum amount, or I guess maybe I should say a maximum amount of the siding that will be used, or could it be the whole thing is siding?
There's not really, I don't think there's any qualifications on percentages as much as it's all masonry products. I think that's what we committed to. So that it's the hardy board, Rick, so it's a considered masonry product. I think that front elevation in the pattern book is real consistent with how it will look. So there'll be a percentage of that kind of a lap siding or board and batten on the front portion of the structure. But no, there's not a definitive percentage identified in the book.
Okay.
Outside of 100% masonry.
And you said there's some pictures in the pattern book that we could use. Is that the? Yeah, I was looking in here. I'm sorry, I didn't bring all the books with me because I can't carry with one hand. The reason I'm asking, just for future reference, is I've started to see some of that doesn't quite look like the quality that I think I kind of used to feel like, hardy board or whatever. I've started to see some of that's kind of a little less quality looking, and so that's why I'm asking.
You want to try that, Matthew, putting it on the main screen?
Could the cable department put the computer screen on the big screen? Thank you.
Yeah, Rick, this may not do it justice really as far as just the size, but the general character I think is a very attractive structure. But I think we can, Mr. Gilliland's here, so we've heard your concerns to make sure that we don't drop off on quality with too much of a high percentage of the hardy board look.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Larry Gilliland, and I appreciate y'all staying late tonight. I know it's been a long day for everyone. So our intent for this project is to do something that's nice and quality. These are the same plans, roughly, that you've approved over there on the Ashton at Salem Creek. We're going to bring those up out of the ground starting next month. We hope to pull permits and start building those. These units are brick and hardy siding. Primarily, the hardy is going to be on the dormers, also on the rear of the buildings around the garages primarily. But the front and the side finishes should be brick and stone with just hardy accents.
Okay, thanks.
Any questions?
Is this, sorry, is, Matthew, I was trying to find, where does the city property end in relation to this? That may be a weird question, but I'm just trying to figure out what is kind of right behind them.
The city property?
Well, I'm looking for what's right behind this, what would be directly, I think, to the east.
What's directly to the east is actually Mr. Bauer's property right here.
And it's county?
No, it's in the city limits. It was annexed about 10 years ago. Mr. Bauer, it's RS-15 in the city limits. Mr. Bauer has about, how many acres do you have, Mr.
Okay.
About 5 acres and
I see it now, okay.
and a single-family home. And what Mr. Bauer was referencing earlier was there's a small section of Cedarview Drive right here that we closed off. We still left the access to the Shell station right here, but we closed off Cedarview Drive. So now Mr. Bauer has to go down Suzanne Landon to Jackson Allen. It was advantageous to see the public street line up with Regal Drive instead of having that small separation from the existing Cedarview Drive alignment. And so Jackson Allen Drive aligns directly across the street from Regal Drive, and that was the primary reason why that section of Cedarview Drive was closed. We do envision, as Mr. Bauer alluded to, when the properties to the south here develop at some point in the future, we do envision Suzanne Landon Drive connecting down to Osborne Lane whenever those properties develop, and also heading to the north if the properties to the north of Cedarview Drive ever develop. So it would be a cohesive network of streets. All that would be development driven when people decide to sell their properties, if they decide to sell their properties and have them developed.
Is there any way that we should formulate the streets differently than the way, or could we or should we at this time? We have the opportunity to make it, better for any reason or another. I guess is what I'm asking. Or is this the way it should be?
I think this is the way that I think that we envision the dispersal of traffic both to the north and south eventually when development occurs. Mr. Huddleston may want
okay.
to.
That's okay. I assume you've already gone through that. I just want to make sure I'm having a hard time getting it from here to satellite and figuring out kind of what.
Yeah, we ain't Googling well right now.
Something's up.
The RS-15 property to the north, it is not developed yet, is it?
Just a couple of single-family homes, one on each of those two lots.
Is there any opportunity that this property here, it looks like it goes to the center of the roadway on Cedarview Drive, which Mr. Bauer is exactly right. I would call it a substandard road. Because of the potholes and the lack of drainage in the area there. Is this property going to help that section of Cedarview Drive, or is it going to have any effect whatsoever on it? It looks like it goes halfway into the roadway there.
Yeah, I don't expect that any of the traffic at this time from this development would head to the north to Cedarview Drive. They would really have no reason to do so, with there just being 3 homes and the mobile home park. And I don't know if we would require any improvements in the right-of-way of Cedarview Drive. Mr. Huddleston may need to chime in on that one. But the one thing I can speak to is the property doesn't actually, the zoning boundary that you see in blue, our zoning ordinance states that zoning boundaries go to the center line of the road. So his property actually, Mr. Gilliland's property actually stops short of where the blue area is. It's just shown as going to the center line of the road, because that's what our zoning ordinance dictates, that we graphically show the zoning boundaries, how we graphically show the zoning boundaries. And there's no access to this development proposed for Cedarview Drive. All of the access would be either off of Suzanne Landon or Jackson Allen. You know, and I have discussed with Mr. Bauer before about his property, how you know, there are some constraints, and a lot of those constraints have to do with access presently. And I think that if and when his property develops, and you know, that's an unknown at this time, you know, there would have to be consideration given to improvement of Cedarview Road with that development.
We reviewed the condition of Cedarview Drive many years ago. Obviously, the narrow width was a concern for us, but what I do find as we look at Cedarview Drive east of Susan Landon, the right-of-way is there for an improvement that could be worked in with a development plan or some other plan with Mr. Bauer's property. And I think, Mr. LaLance, you alluded to it, that the street network looked like it was Susan Landon Drive proposed to go north and south, and that's certainly true. And so Mr. Bauer's property and that right-of-way could be used to connect to a larger street network, tying into other streets north and south of there, as well as continuing to have access to Jackson Allen Drive. So the right-of-way's there. We need, we'll remind you of this from time to time, we need two things to do a construction project: a place to build it and money to build it with. And so the place to build an improvement to Cedarview is there. The timing and the money to build it with might be a question for us at this time, but if Mr. Bauer's question is as to the marketability and the ability to improve access, there's certainly that opportunity with Cedarview Drive along his frontage, and plus about 150, perhaps 200 feet of this part of the development as well.
So where Suzanne Landon Drive stubbing off there, we're assuming that it's going to go all the way across to the development that's probably going to take place on the
Brooks Gerald property.
Brooks Gerald.
Mr. Smotherman? Yes.
Where's on my map?
And that's exactly what we've proposed in the master plan for the Brooks Gerald property. There's a public street to the east from Memorial, and then a stub street to the property immediately south of there. And I think if our maps are correct, that's one lot deep is the two undeveloped, or the two single-family lots that are just north of Cedarview.
And to the south, to Osborne Lane, also.
That's our vision, yes, sir.
All right.
And I might add that it was in anticipation of the additional traffic going north and south on Suzanne Landon that Mr. Balachandra, in his infinite wisdom, wanted to make sure that there was going to be minimal parking on Suzanne Landon Drive, and that's why we pushed the applicant to provide rear access garages and alleyways for all the lots to provide minimal on-street parking and minimal driveway cuts, because we do feel that this will be an important north-south link in the area.
And at some point, we're guessing that, and you may have said this, I've been Googling so much here, I don't even know what's going on, to be honest. But we've got Jackson Allen lined up with Regal on Memorial. Do you think that'll become signalized at some point?
Mr. Huddleston, in his infinite wisdom, is nodding yes. Of course, that's dependent upon...
That's a lot of infinite wisdom.
in his finite wisdom. Of course, that's dependent upon TDOT, of course, but
Yeah, but that would, I'm assuming the reason we don't want Cedar View Drive open back up is because it would be so close to that signalized intersection should it become one.
and I think that having that alignment across from Regal puts it in better position in the future for a potential signalized intersection.
By not having any drives coming out onto the Jackson Allen and Susan Landon, then we should have free-flowing traffic going through there. It shouldn't be like going through so much a neighborhood. It would be more like the backs of those properties, even though I'm assuming the front of them probably going to face the roadway. But
and we made sure they provided plenty of guest parking as well.
So it's
when
that drive's completed across.
It doesn't look, it looks like to me that it'll be answered. It's just going to be a little bit of time. Is what it kind of appears to. And in the meantime, you have to make 2 turns instead of 1. But, overall, I'm okay with the project. I'll move for approval.
Motion is second. Ms. Wright, call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Abstain. All right, we'll now consider recommendations of the Planning Commission to schedule public hearings for zoning approximately 27.34 acres to amend the Emerald Place PUD located along Las Casas Pike. Investment Partners, LLC, the developer. Zoning for approximately 46.2 acres located along Sulphur Springs Road to amend the Estates of Primm Springs PRD, formerly Oakley Springs PRD, City of Murfreesboro Engineering Department. Amend the zoning ordinance regarding Section 2 definitions, Section 7 site plan review, Section 26 off-street parking, queuing and loading pertaining to pavement materials and on-site review. City of Murfreesboro Planning Department applicant. Mr. Balmy, what date have you got for us?
Mayor McFarland, we would recommend August 17th. We already have one public hearing scheduled that day. This would make it an even 4.
Move to, do we have to have move for approval for August 17th?
Second.
Motion is second. Ms. Wright, call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. We'll now consider recommendations of the Airport Commission with a land lease agreement with TDK Hangar LLC. Mr. Gerke.
Hello, Mayor and members of the City Council. As you know, some projects seem to move quite quickly, some seem to go slow, and some never make it even before you. We have several gentlemen here today that are as glad to be before you today with this project as I am. We have Mr. Tim and John Keach, Peter Patton of Air Methods, which is better known as Lifelight in this area, and also Steve Waldron, our Airport Commission Chair. The Airport Commission is bringing to you tonight a land lease for about 2 acres, which is located in the northeast corner of what was the old soccer fields. I have a drawing on the computer for you just so that you can see the area outlined in red. It's a area that was fenced in a few years ago during the runway construction, where we have a taxiway already trying to support that area. TDK Hangar is proposing to build a large facility on this lot. It is a hangar that is with a hangar bay of around 16,800 square feet with some offices that are around 8,000 square feet. Part of that office facility will be the crew quarters for the Lifelight helicopter for Air Methods, where at 24 hours a day we have pilots, nurses, and flight crew here at all times, along with some maintenance staff. We also have for you a drawing of the exterior of what this hangar may also look like. This proposed hangar that TDK Hangar is proposing is in the neighborhood of about $2.5 million for all these facilities. Beyond their land lease area, they're also proposing to extend Taxiway Echo. They're also proposing to put several utilities, gas, water, sewer, electricity, and other conduits for future expansion under Taxiway Echo. This is really important because our future growth in what will be the old soccer field areas, which are part of the north, what we call the north ramp of the airport, will be an area where we'll be building future hangars, land leases, some corporate hangars and things like that. Basically, our next move will be quite easy and less expensive, where we'll be able to basically plug and play into the facilities that this land lease and this agreement allows us to perform. It is going to be an important part also of our future development, in that the quality of this facility really is the cornerstone and sets the standard for future development. These gentlemen are here if you have any questions, and if you have any comments, I'll be glad to handle them. Because of the great amount of improvements that are proposed in this proposal, we are also in this lease agreement looking at the rent of being $1 a year, because the cost of these improvements that they are proposing outside their land lease area is in the neighborhood of $500,000 to $750,000. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have at this time.
Any questions for Mr. Gerke?
I got one question.
Yes.
Will it we were trying to solve a couple of other things. I'm sorry if you said this, I apologize. The one field that's going to be right beside it, will it impact that at all, or is it?
No, you could kind of see in our picture a dark line kind of around that red area, and that's already been fenced off. We are working with Parks and Recreation to try to keep as many of those other fields going as much as possible. So I don't think we'll have any more encroachment on any fields at this time, especially these lit fields that are up front.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was at. I didn't know, does the light, are you going to come to us in a few months and say, oh, we got to take the lights down because it interferes with the life light or whatever? I mean, is there anything like that?
I don't believe so. I think the crew has been operating out of the airport for about 3 years now, or going on to the third year, and we haven't had any complaints from the pilots or anything like that.
Can we go ahead and just approve building the new terminal tonight as well? Is that maybe just?
If you love to, that'll be our next big project we'll be bringing to you.
No other questions, I move for approval.
Second.
Motion is second. Ms. Wright, call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
gentlemen.
Mr. Gerke, before you leave, as the airport expands in that direction, I know that they've already put red lights on the softball fields that were over next to where the fireworks display was the other night. And I'm assuming that's because of the airport expansion in that direction. Do these softball fields, do they have that same lighting on them? Because I could see that becoming a factor with flights coming in and out of there at night.
No, because the Life Flight helicopter, just like all the other aircraft, uses the runway. So the ramp in front of this hangar will not be a landing site. Just as they operate off of our main ramp, they go out to the runway. If we were to create a landing pad there, then we would have to create some approaches. So that's the great thing about them using our runway and facilities.
Okay, good. It's not going to mess up the fireworks show, right?
We're gonna talk to Carl Pease about that. Make sure we got the right size mortars and everything, and can still light it up.
Those fireworks are poofy and nice.
That's right. Exactly.
All right, item 13 has been withdrawn. Mr. McCurry's dad is sick, so we'll have him in our prayers. We'll consider recommendations of the city manager. And gentlemen, y'all have sat here all night, so unless y'all just want to sit here, y'all are free to go. So,
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Consider recommendations of the city manager regarding the human resource director recruitment.
Sure. Mayor, members of City Council, our HR department does a phenomenal job in helping us recruit all of our employees, including members of the leadership team. But with the vacancy in the human resource director position, I felt it would be in the city's best interest to have some measure of independence. So I've selected the firm Strategic Government Resources, SRG, to assist us with the recruitment of the human resource director position. In this role, they would plan, advertise, screen candidates, evaluate candidates, and then deliver a number of candidates to the city manager to select to be interviewed using the same process we use, and at that point, we would make a decision using our staff panel and community panels. The process is expected to take about 15 weeks. The cost for this is $18,500 plus up to $8,500 for reimbursable expenses. My staff report this time was quite extensive. I tried to give you material on the other communities they've worked in. They worked in 300 local government communities, including several in Middle Tennessee, as well as some examples of the advertising recruitment profile that they use to really generate a lot of interest in the position and a number of applicants. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
It looks like this is one of the top 3 recruiting firms in the country, and it was impressive to see the positions that they had filled locally. I don't remember what they all were, but there were several of them that were very close by, and it was a pretty impressive resume. I move for approval.
Second.
Motion second. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris. Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Have 2 board appointments tonight. Mr. Rommel McCurry to the Urban Environmental. I think Mr. McMurray is here in the back, I think. Thank you for your willingness to serve. Reappoint Mr. John Duke, Pat Essenbice, and Linda Roberts. And it's McMurray, not McCurry. We just talked about our golf pro, Mr. McCurry, so.
Move for approval. That's a really good board. And I think Mr. McMurray will be a real asset to it as well.
Second.
Motion second. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. You have one beer permit, Ms.
We
Wright?
do. We have a special event taking place July 29th at Daffodil Hill at 1710 East Main Street. This is a fundraiser for Main Street, and their application is in order.
Move for approval.
Motion second. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. We have, under other business, do we have any statements?
No, sir.
Okay, under other business, we have a request from the Murfreesboro City Schools. Mr. Lyons?
Sure. Dr. Gilbert brought these to us. School starts August the 4th, and they've got 2 items that they wanted to move forward now to save money, make sure they were ready for the school year. The first was to waive the bid process for 1 special education bus and 2 regular education buses in the amount of $278,340. These would be purchased from previously awarded bids done by neighboring counties. So these were competitively established prices. The funds would come from city-held bond funds shared from Rutherford County. Ms. Wright has indicated that funds are available and the project meets the bond use, so we would recommend that the council waive the bid process and approve Mid-South Bus Center for the purchase of 1 special education bus and 2 regular education buses, utilizing the bids from Cumberland and Medford County.
Any questions? Move for approval.
Second.
Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Abstain.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye.
All right, the second piece of this, the city council approved capital items for the budget for city schools from county shared bond proceeds. City schools would request to purchase voice over internet protocol that was included in the capital budget. If we can get this equipment ordered by July 26th, there are savings of $11,000. So we would recommend the purchase from Right Core in the amount of $250,566.10, and this is a GSA contract, again, competitively priced.
Second.
Motion second. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Couple quick, we have one more thing under other business. We have the Senior Trust, Elder Trust Settlement Grant.
recently, the opportunity for senior centers across the state came up about putting in for the Senior Trust Elder Grant funding that lists several categories, including affordable housing, senior legal assistance, senior dental, and senior transportation. We have senior centers across the state that are going to work together to form an alliance for transportation for social programs out, and we would like to apply and have a memorandum of understanding between us and the 50 Forward Center that will be our grant writer for this opportunity. So requesting that I would be able to sign the grant and go into an agreement with the grant writers. This would be purchasing of transportation buses, 3 over the next 3 years, replacing the vehicles that we have in process now if we were awarded the grant.
I move approval.
Can I ask a quick question? Why were we, Rob, Mr. Lyons, is that typically something that you would sign? I mean, why? I've never heard this before.
Yeah, well, our practice, Mr. Lance, has been when we apply for a grant, it takes a little bit of work and there's some staff time involved. And then when the grant comes forward, oftentimes there's a city match. So before we ever apply, we want to make sure the council is okay with that direction, because what we wouldn't want to have happen is to go through the process, get recommended for a grant award, and have the council say, we're not interested in that project. So before we proceed, we want to make sure we're going in the direction the council is comfortable with.
There's no match, but this is a pass-through through the state. So we usually bring federal and state grants before you.
Do our department heads typically sign off on those things, or do you?
Pardon me?
The mayor sometimes does.
Okay. I was curious why. I've never heard someone say we're giving you permission to sign an agreement on behalf of the city. I mean, basically,
We've done that before.
Okay.
We just want to make sure we're all in agreement.
I want to make sure I'm going the right way.
How many buses do we currently have?
We currently have one 24-passenger bus and one 15-passenger van. The van would be the first one that we would want to replace. It's great, quite a bit of issues with heating and cooling, suspension. It's not selected to go for replacement to 2019-2020. So it's given us quite a bit of issues. So is the Rover-style bus that has the ramp issue that not only we see as a senior center, but the Rover program says.
You got a motion?
Yeah. I think
we have a motion.
We need a second. Who's the second?
Second.
Okay. Roll.
Vice Mayor Skels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Shacklet.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Have one quick item. I've passed it out to you guys, but it's the agenda or the timeline for the city manager evaluation. Kenya is going to Ms. Tigg is going to send an email out tomorrow, but I met with Mr. Broughton with MTAS and came up with a good agenda. But August 1st, the forms will be distributed. You'll have a couple weeks to get those prepared, and then he wanted to sit down and do individual interviews with the council members by the facilitator. Then he'll prepare that. We'll have a finding summary sent to us by the end of August. September 7th, we'll have a work session, summary evaluation by the facilitator, and then September 7th at the regular meeting and other business, we'll talk about any compensation adjustment. And then after he is recommending individual meeting of the council members with the city manager individually to discuss performance, just to have that one-on-one dialogue that he had talked about. Second, we have an eclipse coming up. And the viewing is at?
They're actually going to have a number of viewing parties in the community. There will be a viewing party here at the Civic Plaza. The Linebaugh Library, I think, is helping out with. Parks and Rec is working on a eclipse party at Siegel Park. And then lastly, MTSU is also planning an event on campus with some of the professors. So
what's the date on that?
August 21st, and it's just after the lunch hour.
So you have plenty of time.
Is eyewear going to be available at those events? I know MTSU's got, I think, 15,000 pair of glasses or something out there they're expecting.
I believe Parks and Rec is planning to have eyewear. It's going to be first come, first served. I don't know how many they have, but we'll get some more information out. I know Mr. Browning was running on that this afternoon.
Rick needs time to be able to walk over and close his plantation shutters to make sure that none of it gets in his house.
My eyes are getting sensitive as I'm aging.
Getting older. All right. Any other business? Seeing none, it's been a long night. We'll close the council meeting. We'll be adjourned.